Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being here. I see that we are all influenced by the spirit of London's cosmopolitan ways. Everyone was late, so inshallah, we do whenever. And mañana, as they say in Latin America. So we are not on time. When the Brits had their empire and ruled the world, they were punctual. Now they are relaxed. Maybe it's a good thing too. At any rate, I am a glutton for punishment because I am only a specialist on Jewish history and Jewish-Polish relations as punishment by default, because usually it's a minefield unless you want to follow the mainstream interpretation, which is oftentimes not grounded in any solid research, but repeats and regurgitates 50 years of memories from one side, namely the Jewish side. The Poles kept to themselves. For the most part, they failed to publish their story, to establish their narrative as anything legitimate. So the result is the Polish concentration camps. And you guys are the descendants of the SS. I resent that. When I was young and beautiful in California, growing up, I read shiploads of Jewish memoirs and other material, including some scholarly and some punditry in particular that passed for scholarship. Now, Norman Davies, whom I love and whom I met when he first showed up at Stanford, I sat on his classes, at one point refused to talk about anything Jewish-Polish. He said, no more. I refuse to, because it's simply a monologue, and unless you agree with the dominant paradigm, you are castigated and stigmatized as an anti-Semite. Well, my response is, if one was an anti-Semite, one would proudly tattoo a swastika on one's forehead. So, we are in the West. This is not the Soviet Union or Nazi Germany. We are free to inquire, and that's what I have been doing. By the way, my field is Sovietology. I was a student of Robert Conquest, may he rest in peace, at the Hoover. I knew Adam Ulam, a fantastic scholar from Lvov. I knew subscribe to Lvov and Kresy. I will be making commercial interruptions because the topic is morbid. I also am a student of Professor Martin Malia. Adam Ulam, Robert Conquest, Martin Malia, and Richard Pipes are perhaps the only non-prostitutes among the Sovietologists, just like David Satter was an exception among Western journalists who covered the Soviet Union. Fantastic people, and that is what my prime interest is, anything between Berlin and Moscow and Tallinn and Athens in the 19th and 20th century. I also teach geography and strategy. I teach mass murder prevention in failed states in real time. Of course, we go back to the caves to examine the human condition, and we do discuss minutely the Holocaust as one of the examples of horrors that can be visited by government upon human beings. I highly recommend a book, Death by Government. And then you will realize that only in certain Western settings, government tends not to kill, not to mass murder. I teach comparative civilizations and some other stuff. At any rate, since most people are reluctant to discuss such topics, by default, I started looking into things. As I said, when I was an undergraduate student in California, I would read things. I was first shocked and startled, then I calmed down, because everyone has the right to spin the tale and tell his story or her story. In particular, witnesses. Witnesses or people who experience the horrors. Whatever narration they provide is what they remember or choose to remember. That is their trauma. I take issue with people who call themselves scholars who fail to be critical. So here, what you will hear is not a clash of the Jewish and Polish, or Christian and Jewish points of view. It is simply that I subscribe to a school of methodology which is considered passé. It is a logocentric school, and it is an empirical school. Right now, the dominant school is called postmodernism. Postmodernists posit that there is no truth. They fail to notice that the proposition that the truth does not exist becomes the truth in itself, which they defend to the death. The truth does exist, we can approximate it, that's my school, and that is what I have been doing. I cut my teeth on micro-studies, in particular as far as Jewish-Polish relations are concerned. One of the first I did was a shishki. There was a shtetl and a town, and I examined its existence and its extermination by the Nazis who were not Polish. Are you surprised? Anyway, and then the aftermath of World War II. It was an interesting experience. I based myself for the post-war period mostly on NKVD documents that nobody had bothered really to examine. First of all, they were off limits, and then they were just lingering in boring archives. What I write as far as history is boring. It takes me about 5 to 15 years to research a topic, and then a year or so to write a book, and then everybody falls asleep. So what I have to share with you is not sexy, it's not pop cultural, it's history. I hate shouting at people, but okay, I'll lift it up. Thank you for calling me soft. At any rate, I remember as an undergraduate reading in, I think, Ruben Einstein's book, who pretended to be a historian, that Polish Nazis during the Warsaw Uprising killed more Jews than Germans. Wow, geez, well, that's great. And this still passes for scholarship. It's getting better. If you pick up the newest book by Joshua Zimmerman about the relationship between the Polish underground and the Jewish community during the Second World War, it's more nuanced. He still has much to learn, but for goodness sake, the products that were published when Poland was enslaved and had no voice were just atrocious. Just absolutely atrocious. Things are getting better despite what you may gather from mainstream or main gutter media and from mainstream academia. They're getting better because the archives are opened. Everybody can go research, and no solid scholar can avoid it. However, for 50 years in the West there was just one monopoly. The Poles were silent, and in Poland there were National Bolsheviks and communist propaganda, not much else. The emigres were trying to carry on and keep calm. And they were very defensive. Why? Because they lost their paradise called Poland. They were not sine ire et studio when discussing the Second World War in particular. Okay. So that's the introduction. Now on to definitions. I will be talking about Jews and Poles, by which I don't mean to differentiate absolutely, because human beings can have multiple identities. You can see it very well now in a globalized world, but I always remind everyone that this is not an invention of postmodernism, globalism, and the kumbaya liberal attitude that pervades the West these days. One of my favorite documents that I read from the 15th, 16th century from the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth was a guy who signed himself 500 years ago, Natio Polonus, Civitas Lituanorum, Origine Gente Rutenus, Origine Judaorum. This fellow wanted to say, I am a Polish nobleman of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and the Ruthenian people of Jewish origin. You see, a multiple identity at work. He had no doubt he was Polish. At the same time, he noted what he also was. Very interesting. This is pre-modern, but even in pre-modern times, you could have mentalities like this. Generally speaking, to simplify, you could have people who by halakhic law would be considered Jewish. For instance, under the Nazi occupation, the commissary mayor of Warsaw had been a deputy mayor, Julian Kulski, my friend's father, that's why I know this stuff. Julian Kulski had been a deputy mayor to President Starzyński, or Mayor Starzyński of Warsaw. When the Germans arrested Starzyński, they appointed Julian Kulski, who was at the same time a member of the underground. What the Germans didn't know, but what everybody, including every single anti-Jewish endek knew, was that Julian Kulski was the grandson of the great rabbi of Warsaw, who led the Jewish population together with the Christian Poles, both Calvinists, Lutheran, both Protestant and Catholics, during and right before the January insurrection of 1863. So, according to Jewish law, the guy was Jewish. According to Nuremberg law, the guy was Jewish. According to Index, he was the damn Pilsudski guy. According to everybody else, he was Polish. So how do we classify him? You see, I'm simply sending a signal out that it's extremely dangerous to talk about Jewish-Polish relations. What about General Mond, who adhered to Judaism and was a general in the Polish army, in a medical corps, and he called himself Polish, a Pole of Mosaic faith. He found no contradiction between his faith and his chosen nationality. So you can say, oh, those are exceptions because indeed Poland, after the United States, was home to the world's largest Jewish community. And most of those people who considered themselves Jews did not consider themselves Poles, because they were not Christian. That's how they viewed it, and because they were of a different nationality. I will remind you, when Poland was missing in action during the 19th century as a state, people developed modern identities according to what was sexy at the time, and nationalism was sexy. And when young people in the Jewish community emancipated themselves, they did not emancipate themselves according to the paradigm provided by the Polish nobility, which was mostly Catholic and strongly romantically nationalist, Polish. Those who were emancipating themselves from the shtetl of the Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox drew inspiration from all European currents, including nationalism, so they invoked Jewish nationalism. They modified Herzl. Usually they were also, include Jewish nationalists, Zionists, were also of the socialist persuasion. Not all, naturally. There were religious Zionists, the Mizrahi, and there were liberal Zionists who mostly were grouped in a organization called Gordonia. That's in the interwar period, of course. There were also Jewish radical nationalists. They hated the Reds. By this I mean they hated not just the Bolsheviks or Jewish communists, so-called Kombund, which were infiltrated by the Soviets naturally. They hated the Bund, which was a Jewish nationalist organization but non-Zionist, and it wanted autonomy in Yiddish, not Hebrew. They hated all Reds. What did they like? Well, Mussolini, they liked Piłsudski, and they were quite powerful. Now, those are the followers of Vladimir Zew Jabotyński, Zionist revisionists. Please imagine that in Poland there were about 40,000 of them. Their Polish Christian counterparts, national radicals, fielded 5,000. So Jewish radical nationalism, that the Jewish opponents of called fascism, was extremely strong. They felt strongly Jewish. Many of them were of the intelligentsia, and they were naturally assimilated to a large extent in the Polish culture. So you had a kind of a hybrid. Again, phenomenon. So we will be talking about Jews and Poles, and because this is about World War II, we should look at Jews and Poles the way that the occupiers regarded them. And there were two kinds of occupiers. Poland had two enemies, Hitler and Stalin. Both discriminated ethnically. In the Soviet occupation, because you remember World War II started after Stalin and Hitler made friends, and Hitler attacked first and Stalin joined him. That's the beginning of World War II. Each occupation had different rules. In the Soviet occupation, the main enemy was identified unequivocally as the Polish lords. Polish, I stress. Now, if you were a Ukrainian village levy under the Polish government in the interwar period, you were considered a Polish lord. If you were a Jewish merchant, you were also a bourgeois enemy and a Polish lord. And you would be repressed. If you were a Polish officer, say the chief rabbi of the Polish army, Major Baruch Steinberg, then you would be shot by the Soviets because you were a Polish lord. Okay. Under the Nazi occupation, the hierarchy of horror was different. Jews were at the very bottom, then the gypsies, then the Polish lords, elite, because the Nazis were ferocious, but they thought the people would make all right slaves. Heinrich Himmler proposed that each Pole should know how to spell his name. By this he meant ethnographic material. The people, not the elites. The elites should be exterminated. But each Pole ought to know how to spell his name and count to 300. Hitler promised the Germans a Polish slave and a Volkswagen each, or a Slavic slave. They were Untermenschen, not as bad as the Jews. The Jews were slated, and the policy evolved for wholesale extermination. And remember, whereas there were exceptions and you could get an Arisierung certificate that you were an Aryan, even though you had a Jewish ancestor in Germany, you could still fight in the Wehrmacht, and there were about 100,000 Germans of Jewish origin in the Wehrmacht, but there was no such excuse for people who were mixed, Poles and Jews. They were to die too, as Jews. So Catholics who happened to be of Jewish origin, or Christians, Lutherans, it didn't matter. Why? Because Hitler was a progressive socialist. He was a modern man. He was a racist. He was not a religious bigot. I don't know if you, and here I'll make myself popular. There is a tribe, a people called the Karaim, the Karaites. Some of them live outside of Vilna. They used to be attached to the estates of Prince Radziwiłł in Troki. And many more lived in the Crimea. When the Germans pushed east, the Karaim volunteered for the SS. So Heinrich Himmler himself authorized Judaic prayers for the SS. Of course, at first, because the Karaim, the Karaites, are Talmudless Jews, the Germans wanted to exterminate them. Fortunately, Europe's leading anthropologist, Professor Czekanowski, was able to convince the SS scientists that these were Turkic people. And since the Germans, National Socialists, were modern-day racists and socialists, they realized that because of the blood, they shouldn't be exterminating, so they allowed the Karaites to enroll in the SS, but only the ones from Crimea. Yes, history is funnier than what we can possibly invent. But all you have to do is read and study and research. That again doesn't change at all history that the Jews were at the bottom and slated for extermination. The Poles, as the Germans called them, were supposed to lose their head, meaning the elite should be exterminated completely. The elite and then the people partly. There was a hunger plan, most were to be starved to death, perhaps 15 million, Generalplan Ost it was called, were to be kicked out beyond the Urals and just die there. And a few million should be left as slaves. Okay, it sounds harsh unless you're Jewish. Because if you were Jewish during the Second World War under the Germans, that means you were supposed to die, and there were no footnotes. You see? And this is indispensable context. I don't want any unholy competition for martyrdom. This is the context, ladies and gentlemen. The Soviets were deporting more than shooting, and the Germans were, as far as the Jewish population, doing more shooting than deporting. As far as the Christian population, Polish Christian, they were doing more deporting than shooting. And still millions died. We still don't know exactly how many Christians died. Professor Raoul Hilberg, to whom I owe a great debt for methodology, etc. Professor Raoul Hilberg, who is the dean of Holocaust studies, he's now passed away a few years ago. Professor Raoul Hilberg said that it's legitimate to estimate, as far as the Jewish population of Europe, it's legitimate to give the lowest number would be about 5.3 million, the highest 6.2. Why? When there is carnage on an industrial scale, precise statistics are hard to obtain. We can try, but again, we can only approximate. And that is what happened to European Jewry, and that is what happened to Polish Jews, most of whom overwhelmingly died, about 3 million. Now, there are estimates, now there are revisions now, revisionist historians say only 2 million Poles died. Okay, that's still a lot. So, until we have solid studies, and there are very few of those, we won't know exactly. Poland lost 11 million people during the war. 11 million. After the first census, after 1945, showed 11 million people missing. Of course, the borders shifted. I'm not saying everybody died. All I'm saying is that if you compare two censuses, 11 million people were missing. Out of the population of about 30 million. But we don't know again exactly how many people Poland had before the war, because the last census was in 1930 and the next census was scheduled in 1940. Obviously, when Hitler and Stalin invaded, the Polish government was incapable of doing anything but projections. And that's what it did, the Polish government in exile here in London. Okay, so the Polish government in exile, which ended up in London from France, represented all Polish citizens, including Muslims, Polish Tatars, for instance. Since it represented Poland, it represented everybody. There were 3 levels that the Polish government in exile maintained operations on. First, it was with the Allied governments, second, with neutral governments, and third, with enemy governments. Aside from intelligence operations, for instance, the Poles neutralized Vichy French right before Operation Torch, when the Americans descended upon North Africa. Did you know that? That's the famous British-Polish intelligence cooperation, when the Poles did all the work and the Brits took all the credit. And that's how it was. Yes, it took about 60 years to publish anything about it, because the documents were off limits. Again, Poland was absent. Please don't think that it just relates to Polish-Jewish affairs. It relates to everything. If Poland was, and it was, in a totalitarian cage, the Poles were voiceless, including research. You think the communists would brag about Polish intelligence endeavors? No, I don't think so. At any rate, aside from standard operations, there were efforts to help Polish citizens everywhere. For instance, the Poles maintained a relationship with the enemy, say Hungary. Why? There were Polish, Christian and Jewish refugees in Hungary. So even though Hungary was in the enemy camp, firmly a satellite of Berlin, the Hungarian government was rather kind to Polish citizens, to the great chagrin of National Socialists, who were not Polish, they were German. I'll repeat again. The Poles maintained a relationship for the same reason with Romania, Bulgaria, and even Italy, enemy, and with neutral countries such as Portugal and Spain. It was mostly about facilitating the rescue of Polish citizens, no matter what their origin, from the clutches of the Third Reich. I'll give you an example. Professor Richard Pipes. Have you heard about Professor Richard Pipes? Great Sovietologist, a formidable libertarian, freedom-loving person, solid scholar of Russia. He was a kid, a high schooler, I think, at that time. Must have been around 17 or so. I know this story because he went to school with one of my dinosaurs. He's also friends with my boss. So Professor Richard Pipes, according to everyone in Poland, including the Index, who thought his father was a damn Piłsudskiite, was Polish. Ryszard Pipes, Rysio Pipes, that was his name. His family had a chocolate factory called Oza. They were Czech Jews who became Polonized. His father was a Piłsudskiite legionary. He was in Poland's elite. You understand what I'm saying? Then the Germans conquered Poland and the Soviets. The Pipeses were lucky to be still in the German-held part of Poland. Then General Wieniawa-Długoszowski, who was Poland's ambassador in Rome, prevailed upon Mussolini to issue exit visas to the Pipeses and the whole family. In December 1939, hopped on the train, made it to Rome. Then General Wieniawa-Długoszowski talked to our favorite 2 guys in Europe, General Franco and Salazar, both dictators issued transit visas. Then the Polish Council in New York had some problems with tolerant, liberal, and open-minded Roosevelt administration, which refused to take Jews in. Fortunately, since the Pipeses figured as Poles, they were allowed in. Oh yeah. How do you like that story? This is a micro example of the Polish government in exile's operation to rescue somebody. There were zillions like this. The council, Polish councils in Spain, Pan Kobylański, świętej pamięci was his name, and in Portugal, never knew the family, so I don't remember the name, should have their trees in Yad Vashem as rescuers. Yes. One time, Professor Pipes thanked Stalin for liberating him, for saving him, on TV. And his friend, Iwo Pogonowski, who went to high school with him, called him and yelled at him. So, what the heck are you doing? You should have thanked Mussolini. But that's just between friends. And it should be censored, don't repeat it outside. Professor Pipes explained that he meant that Stalin actually killed the most Germans and entered Berlin. That's what he meant. But it sounded awkward. It was a good chance on TV to come clean. But since Professor Pipes is considered by the open-minded to be right-wing, he's a libertarian. Then I think he was reluctant to talk about subtle things. And history tends to be subtle. Okay. The most important field of the Polish government in exile's endeavor was the Western Allies and Soviets. Again, it was in the Soviet Union. It was about Polish deportees, Polish citizens who were taken deep into the Gulag. And when Stalin, who was a Nazi ally, switched sides in 1941 because he quarreled with Hitler and vice versa, suddenly the Polish government in exile was able to reclaim or try to reclaim and help Polish citizens. Among them people like Menachem Begin, who had been arrested by the NKVD, which, by the way, was not bent on saving Jewish lives, as you can imagine. And those people got out with the Polish government. Was there discrimination as far as the army is concerned? Well, people bring their prejudices both ways. For instance, some charge that the Polish army was reluctant to enlist Polish Jews. Well, there was a widespread opinion that Jews are not loyal. And there was some truth to it. I'm not talking about stories about allegedly treasonous behavior of the Jewish population when it was only young people and communist sympathizers in the East when the Soviets entered. I'm talking about people like Menachem Begin. From the very beginning he said, hey, once we get to the West, to Palestine, I'm going to defect. And there were so many Poles that the Polish government wanted to save from Russia. There was reluctance on the part of the Polish military to take people who said they were Zionists. They were not interested in fighting for Poland. Yes, it would be nice if they could be saved from the Soviet Union, from the clutches of Stalin. But hey, what's the priority? Whom do we take? We take people who want to fight in the Polish army. So there used to be a fantastic dinosaur Sovietologist, Leo Labodz. I'll say it in Polish. Podchorąży Leon Łabądź, who fought at Monte Cassino. He was a cadet officer, fantastic Sovietologist here in London. He published survey. He never had any problems like this. Nobody said to him, hey, you're Jewish, so you can't go. Well, they treated him like he was Polish. So he was going to fight for Poland. What about Lieutenant Felix Rohatin? Have you heard of him? A friend of my family, 24th Lancers Regiment with General Maciek. You haven't heard of him? He became the commander of Israeli armor. He was with the 24th Lancers fighting the Germans. He was going to go back to Poland except for the communists. So he went to Israel. He was a Polish officer. First, he was a Jew. Everybody knew that. He was of Jewish origin. But he was not a fighting Zionist at that time, like Menachem Begin and some other of his followers, which made it very difficult to reconcile their departure from the Soviet Union, as desirable as it was. That would eventually cast shadow on Polish-Jewish relations too. Whom do we rescue first from the clutches of Stalin? Now, the relationship with the Western Allies was, as far as Jewish-Polish relations are concerned, was fraught with different difficulties. Namely, Anthony Eden said, the Poles always talk about German atrocities. They are minor allies and they would like to make a splash. And that's the reaction to Polish reports, which started early and concerned Nazi measures against Polish Jews. The reluctance to accept the horror was palpable. Whether it was President Roosevelt or here, the Foreign Office, nobody wanted to believe. Well, in all fairness, Marek Chodakiewicz told me a story one time. He was the last, now he's dead, but he was the last living for a long time after the war, the deputy commander of the Jewish fighting organization. He was a leftist, he was a decent man. And he told me that there were refugees, fugitives, who escaped from eastern Poland, occupied by the Nazis, who came into Warsaw, and they were able to sneak into the Warsaw Ghetto, and they would tell other Jews that the Germans were shooting everybody, including women and children. And nobody wanted to believe that. Why? Because human beings can't process atrocity and horror stories unless they are at the end of the barrel, so to speak. It's just inhuman. Normal human beings can't relate. So maybe let's cut the Western Allies a little bit of slack. They were also reading here in England, through Enigma, the Einsatzgruppen communications about mass shootings. And the Einsatzgruppen not only used the code, but also a bureaucratic code. Ausrottung, you have to learn that lingo of the killers to understand what they are saying. But I think British intelligence had some smart people. The Poles gave them an Enigma machine. They improved on it. So they knew, but knowing and seeing pieces, it doesn't mean that you have a full picture. So take that under the consideration. The Polish government also, to a large extent, was convinced that it should amplify its message, not only because it concerned Polish citizens as far as the Holocaust and anything else, but also because it believed that Jewish organizations had inordinate power to intervene or to influence things. And the Jewish organizations were absolutely powerless. There were attempts at cooperation, which went well. That is, Jewish charitable organizations and others were able to pass material aid, money in particular, to Polish commandos who were dropped. For instance, my uncle Lonio, when he was dropped in 1942 in Poland, had a lot of gold on him. He broke his leg. He did. Because he had failed, he was afraid of jumping at night. So when he was training here in Great Britain, the Brits told him to jump from a balloon. He said, I can jump from a plane, I'm not jumping from a balloon. He landed in September 42, broke his leg. Which was not good news, because the Germans were around. At any rate, so that worked out. But Jewish organizations were absolutely powerless. Information and data and intelligence from the Polish government in exile was simply brushed aside, just as pleas or dramatic symbolic acts like the suicide of a Polish government minister, a politician, who killed himself here in London. So the people, he got it. He and his NDEC colleagues suspected the worst of the Germans. So ironically, Jewish members of the Polish government in exile and nationalist Christian members of the Polish government in exile were the first to believe the worst of the Germans. And he got it, and because there was no human reaction, no government, not Polish, but British and American, reaction to the Holocaust, to the mass killing, he killed himself, opened up gas and committed suicide. It didn't make any difference. Why? Well, Jewish leaders would come, some of them, and would ask about help. In the United States, the New York Times basically failed to inform anybody about anything. There's a book, Beyond Belief, if you want to read it. And that's the American press's reaction to the Holocaust. Nobody wanted to believe, and nobody cared, really. And then many Jewish leaders said, well, we should not really make any noises about it in America. Why? It started already in the 1930s. Imagine that there was no mass demonstration after Kristallnacht. Because the administration, liberal, open-minded, convinced the Jewish community leaders that they should not make any noises. Not make any noises. There was no demonstration in New York against Kristallnacht. So later, going along the same lines, very nice people from the State Department would say, hey, just keep quiet. Everything will be fine. We're taking care of it. Yeah. The thing was that the military, especially the Air Force, when approached to do something about Auschwitz, since the Hungarian Jews were being mass murdered, to bomb the rail links, refused to. Even though they bombed within 40 miles of Auschwitz, there was a synthetic gasoline factory. So they bombed it, but they couldn't fly 40 miles more. Why? There were two reasons, and I think President Roosevelt articulated it. First of all, the Nazis claimed that the war was launched by the Jews. So anything the Allies did was Jewish work and under Jewish control. So let's not do anything pro-Jewish. Let's not do anything pro-Jewish because this is going to feed into this Nazi propaganda narrative. That's number one. Number two, President Roosevelt said, our objective is to win the war. When we win the war, the Holocaust will stop. Okay, so anybody who thinks that Jews run the world or control the world, there you go. SS Brigadeführer Erich von den Bach, Żelewski, said at Nuremberg, and he wrote it, I think, in his diary first. He was one of the bosses of the Einsatzgruppe. He was a mass murderer. And he says, I was standing there on the field and my SS troops were mass murdering defenseless women and children. And nobody was doing anything. So then I realized the Jews must not be running the world. Okay, so now that we have put that to sleep, even some of the top SS realized it, the Jewish community had very little influence. And overall, the cooperation with the Polish government in exile was all right. As little as anybody could do was done. Okay. So this is about the Western Allies and the Soviets. I'll just mention something about the Soviets. I get annoyed when we observe the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz as a great Soviet achievement. Let me tell you, the NKVD knew what it was. They knew what Majdanek was. They knew about everything else. Nobody was briefed. at the Red Army? Because they didn't care. They were simply marching west. If they bumped into a camp, they let people in. They let people out. Do you know what Theresienstadt was? A Denmark among Nazi concentration camps. This was actually a decent facility to show the Red Cross and Swiss dupes among the journalists who visited. Theresienstadt. When the Soviets got to Theresienstadt, the inmates look half decent, so they raped them. Oh yeah, you want to read documents at the US Holocaust Memorial Museum? Liberation means to bring freedom. Did the Jewish community get its properties back? Or individual Jews? No, communism came. That's what happened to the Jews. And everybody else too. The Soviets did not give a hoot. Stalin always viewed it as a great propaganda coup, that he could portray himself as a great liberator of Jews. He didn't care. He cared much less than Roosevelt. And he was complicit in unleashing the Holocaust by being an ally of Hitler. Nobody likes to remember about it. Instead, we celebrate the liberation of Auschwitz. I would like to ask you to watch the newsreels from the liberation of Auschwitz. There is a famous picture of children, Mengeles children, twins and others, who survived the experiments. Have you seen that newsreel? Being taken out of Auschwitz. Who takes care of them? You know, ladies in those strange hats? They're called nuns. Last time I checked, they were not members of the Red Army. Why? Because the Red Army was completely unprepared. They were happy to kill some Germans and open up a camp, but this was not their objective. They couldn't care less. The only operation to liberate a concentration camp that was a planned operation on the Eastern Front occurred at a little town called Holishev. That was a sub-camp of Flossenburg. There were about 2,000 women with 300 Jewish women in a separate barrack, surrounded by barbed wire and gasoline barrels ready to blow up, except the SS went to lunch. Yes. Guess what happened? The Germans were very unlucky, because the Polish underground found out about it, and the Holy Cross Brigade of the National Armed Forces, where the paratrooper commando Lonio Zubzdanowicz was the chief of staff. And what they did was they liberated the camp and killed most of the SS because they were very not open-minded. On the spot. And if you think I'm kidding, the Jewish Voice of New Jersey, it describes the whole thing. It's a local paper. The historians haven't yet taken measure of this operation. This is the only time that I can tell you on the Eastern Front for sure. There were operational orders. Once they found out that there was a camp, oh, by the way, the local Czech civilian population said, don't do anything, because if you do anything, the Germans will come back and kill us. They were told to get lost. This was beginning of May 1945. The Holy Cross Brigade was marching to hook up with General Patton, which it did. And General Patton saved them from the Soviets because that outfit had fought against both Nazis and communists. You know, the best Poles are equal opportunity haters. They hate totalitarians, both brown and red. Okay, well, so much for the Soviets. Had the Czechs waited for the Soviets, the Jewish women would have been dead, and probably the rest of the women would have been haphazardly massacred, because Himmler issued orders no prisoner was to fall in the hands of the Allied. By the way, this is the exact order that in 1941 Beria issued. Shoot the reactionary elements and about 40,000 prisoners. Poles, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Jews, Tatars were killed when the Red Army was retreating. They were killed by the Soviet secret police in June and July 1941. I even found in German gendarmerie papers that they killed Jewish prisoners of the communists. So they admitted it to themselves that Jews were victims of the communists as well, which of course doesn't get any play. The Jews are supposed to be always leftist and pro-Soviet. Very strange indeed. But again, for 50 years, there was no freedom to research, compare, discriminate, look at things seriously. And now the hardest part, at home. The relationship between the Jews and the Poles took place at the official level and at the popular level. Most of what occurred was a reaction to what the occupiers, in particular the Germans, imposed. And since the Germans discriminated against everybody who was not German, everybody found oneself in a different context. So to understand what happened at home, you have to look at continuities and discontinuities. And I'll go into it deeper in a second. Let me talk first about the official level. Within the Home Army, mainstream underground group, and the government plenipotentiary, which was the civilian counterpart of the underground, there were various strains. Since it was an umbrella organization, some, probably most, had harbored anti-Jewish feelings, not exterminationists, just typical prejudices that were evident everywhere in the Western world. Did you know that in the 1930s, on certain buildings in Chicago, there were plaques that says "No Jews and Dogs"? Or that there were segregated beaches not for blacks in Miami, but the Jews were not allowed because they were not welcome. So that kind of an ugly prejudice. I don't know about country clubs here, I can only tell you about America, but most political parties, especially on the right, didn't want unassimilated Jews. On the left, it depended. Probably the socialists were the only ones who saw a civic model, so they didn't care not only what ethnicity, but what culture. If you were not of Polish culture, you should be okay too. Various organizations, underground organizations, treated the so-called Jewish question in a variety of ways. We did a very thorough study. Dr. Bushinsky did a very thorough study, helped of Polish underground nationalist press, and most of the content was favorable to the Jewish predicament. The nationalist press, and remember, if you publish an underground newspaper, it was an automatic death sentence. They bothered to list mass murder of Jews. They were some of the first examples where some of the worst anti-Semites were publishing some of the first examples of mass murder of Jews. And they would say, you see what the Germans are capable of? We always have told you how the Germans were. So there were a few only examples of negative coverage, which mostly had to do with behavior of young Jews under the Soviet occupation, and some abstract cliches. Now this is astonishing because before the war, the nationalist press was obsessed with the Jewish population, or just Jews. There was a Jew behind every tree, under every stone. There was a Jewish conspiracy. My goodness! And then bang, bang, during World War II, nothing like this. Oftentimes, so-called historians in the West would say, oh, Polish Nazis, really? Show me an issue of Volkische Beobachter, as we found in the Polish Christian nationalist press of the National Radical camp, which says, we will salute Jews who are Polish patriots. Well, show me an issue of Volkische Beobachter, and that's underground press. Nobody forced them. There was no censorship whatsoever, except military censorship. Meaning they weren't bragging about certain things that Only insane people would brag in the underground. And as you see, my little talk is a corrective on stereotypes that prevail in the West. But various organizations treated people differently. Further, as I showed in my dissertation, which was a micro-study of the county 1939-1947, and in my various publications, it all depended on a locality and people. Remember, human beings can act differently even at different times and do different things. Joshua Zimmerman was shocked to discover that in Volhynia the Home Army enrolled a Jewish company. Why? They were fighting against the Germans and Ukrainian nationalists who were common enemies. Plus, Volhynian Jews didn't like the Soviets too much. That was not the case in Novogródek and Vilna regions, where Jewish fugitives, to save lives, escaped to the forest and had to rob to survive. And some of them hooked up with Soviet partisans. And there are Jewish historians in Israel who recognize this was not a question of anti-Semitism, it was a question of a Polish-Soviet war in the forest. Completely different story. Historians grudgingly discover what I learned on my grandmother's knee. For instance, Timothy Snyder, to his great shock, bumped into Rotmistrz Pilecki, Witold Pilecki. This is the guy who volunteered to be taken to Auschwitz on a reconnaissance mission because the Polish underground had no idea what the heck that was. It was a facility where people disappeared into, and really nobody came back. So he agreed to be arrested, taken into the camp, and he spent almost 3 years there. It's a grandfather of a friend of mine, my sister's second best friend, Dorotka Makłej-Obtułowicz. I knew about it. In Poland they didn't know about it because after the war, the communists killed him. He not only volunteered for Auschwitz, created an underground organization, was the first to write reports about gassing of Jews. He escaped from Auschwitz, recuperated, rejoined the underground, fought in the Warsaw Uprising. He was taken prisoner by the Germans, escaped from a POW camp, hooked up with the Polish army in Italy, volunteered for a reconnaissance mission back to Soviet-occupied Poland, where he was captured and killed as a Nazi collaborator, an American spy and a Vatican spy. He was executed by the communists. Oh, guess who was instrumental in his execution? The Prime Minister, Communist Prime Minister Cyrankiewicz. Guess why? Because Cyrankiewicz had been a kapo, a prisoner trustee in Auschwitz. Did I see any demonstrations in the 60s or 70s when Cyrankiewicz visited the West? Did anybody mind? No, no. No Jewish groups shouting Polish anti-Semitism. Here you had a real life kapo. Kapo. Auschwitz kapo. And what? Nothing. Zero about Pilecki, a real hero. Do you know what his favorite book was? Imitatio Christi. You cannot escape from the fact that the Polish reactionaries were the best, and they did it because they are Christian. They helped because there was a deep call within their hearts. It is very embarrassing for modern historians. So when Timothy Snyder discovered Pilecki, he was very uncomfortable with it. And I'll tell you how he discovered it. I helped to edit Pilecki's report from Auschwitz. And I told a friend of mine who is the publisher, Terry Tegnazian, don't ever say that I had anything to do with it. Because I am from that tradition. And if you put my name on it, the press will ignore it. So she didn't. And the report came out in the United States. And Timothy Snyder wanted to make a splash. So he wrote a review. And now he's the discoverer of Pilecki. As President Reagan used to say, you can accomplish a lot if you don't want any credit. And this was a little operation, intelligence, influence operation, and everything's fine. You cannot put Pilecki back into the box of unremembrance. He's out of the closet, and he's powerful. So much has been written about Polish anti-Semites in the Home Army, etc., and the National Armed Forces, etc. But some of them were really anti-Jewish. There is no doubt about it, because that's how culture was. The culture was similar everywhere in the world. Anti-Semitism was sexy. That's unfortunate, but that's how it was. I researched the dynamics of the clashes at the popular level. And I discovered horrible, horrible things that happened to Jewish fugitives in Poland's countryside. Now we're moving to popular level, but and looking at continuities and discontinuities, let me just describe the context. If you were Jewish and wanted to live, you had to escape. If you were in the countryside, you had to go around, beg for food. Most people were robbed of their food by the Germans. There was no food. Well, there was something that the farmers would stash away. So you were better off to try with at the manor house, with the nobility, landed nobility, or with the priest, or someone like this. And the best idea was to approach somebody you knew from business transactions before, because they usually knew you. You walked around villages in 1937 and you bought eggs, so they knew you. They knew who you were, so they'd pick up some eggs. They'd sell you some eggs, and they knew you. So when you returned in 1942, hey, I escaped from the ghetto in Krasnik. Can I have some food? Because, I'm starving. Usually people who knew you would give you food. But then you had to be on the move. You had to be on the move. And you would go begging. Most people would be scared because, say, in the county of Krasnik, is a county supervisor, Kreishauptmann he was called, his function. The Kreishauptmann issued an edict, a decree. Anybody who assists Jews in any way and his neighbors will be killed. By this he meant sharing a cigarette, providing horse and wagon, pointing out the way to escape. And the priests were compelled at the end of the Mass to read. You have to report to forced labor for the Germans. You have to, you remember, we will have First Communion next month. And you have to, according to the German authorities, you may not help Jews. This was read because if the priests didn't read that, they'd be in trouble. I don't know how that can be squared with Christian mercy, but there was no radio, there was really no other mean to convey and project propaganda. They had to read it. At any rate, so say I'm a Jewish fugitive, I walk from one village to the next. If I have a skill, then sometimes they would hide me. I would say I'm a tailor. So I would sew things for them and then move on to another village. I would be fed, but most people didn't have skills that translated immediately into what the farmers needed. Everybody was scared. Some people were greedy. So few Jewish fugitives would be attacked for their shoes or for anything. Oh, by the way, the thugs, and there was at least one in every village, attacked anybody who was weak. They did the same thing to Christians. That's just how it was in the countryside. And I'm very sorry. I wish I could tell you they were all fantastic. I love to share and play the music and dance like the Irish. That's not how Polish peasants are. They're suspicious, they tend to be close-minded, and always those who are dynamic stand out. If you can kill or rob a person with impunity, there was always somebody in every larger village that I studied that would do it. Now the rest would ostracize him, but they were afraid to say anything because he had the power to denounce them to the Germans, especially if he found out that anybody in the village had helped in any way. Remember, you feed a Jew, you die, and your neighbors. So this was a paranoid atmosphere. So I'm a Jewish fugitive moving around, and finally nobody wants to keep me, nobody wants to feed me, so I start robbing to survive. Because of the Holocaust and the slaughter of the Soviet prisoners of war, the Germans destabilized the countryside. Why? Because there were so many fugitives. The Germans were mass murdering Jews, and Jews were running, those who could run away, were running around the countryside and trying to get food. In addition, there was a wave of banditry. Most of the bandits, depending on the locality, same in the Novogródek area, there were ethnic Belarusians. In Kielce area, there were ethnic Poles. Those people were attacking other farmers, they were attacking manor houses, priests, and stealing from them. They would also kill Jews, and sometimes they would hook up, especially with young Jewish men. Especially if those young Jewish men had weapons. So the peasants would complain to the Polish police, and the Polish police would tell the German police. But the Polish police was usually reluctant, because if the Germans came and the Germans got upset, they would burn a village and kill everybody. So sometimes people handle things like this at the local level. Sometimes they would involve the underground. They'd say, oh, they are bandits that always attack us, and this is where they hide. And the underground would go, and an underground unit would go, usually from a different county, so they would not be recognized by the locals, and killed whoever was hiding in the forest, completely oblivious whether those were Soviets, Jews, or Polish bandits. They just killed them. Throw to the mix NKVD paratroopers who started organizing the communist underground. No, they wouldn't take Jewish women and children, no, or elderly. But young Jewish men who had weapons could join reluctantly. Sometimes they were killed. In fact, in the county I studied, the county of Krasny-Kianów, most Jewish fugitives were killed by the communist underground. For weapons, for money, that's how the communists were fundraising. And they left record. I'm not kidding. I went into the party archives and they left record of it. I published 3 volumes of this. Tedious. For me, no, I was very excited. But for normal human beings, tedious. So what we see is Armageddon. But Armageddon that didn't happen overnight under the German occupation. In the countryside where most Jews resided, not in Warsaw, but in the countryside, it was gradual. The Kreishauptmann in the county I studied, I did a micro-study of, complained that despite death penalty, Jews were all over the countryside. They should be in the ghetto, but the ghetto didn't have walls, and it was easy to sneak out. The ghetto had sometimes a fence or something like that. Do you know what the Jewish population was doing? They were doing exactly what they had pursued before the war. They were trading. Until you kill human beings, they will not stop doing what they are used to doing. So there were Jewish merchants running around with scraps of merchandise and doing exactly what they were doing. When they ran out of merchandise, they were going around getting food. And the German authorities were very upset. And they were writing about it. And they would increase anti-Semitic propaganda until there were reprisals and fear. That went on uninterrupted. And the Germans had to send the SS to deport the Jews of the county of Krasny and exterminate them. For this, continuity to cease, for this continuity to stop. It was hell. I'll just give you one story. A forester took in a 3-year-old Jewish girl. Why? Because he had 2 kids who were his son's kids, and the son was in Auschwitz because the son was a member of the underground. A village head who had been a communist and a poacher, who had been arrested by the forester before the war, snitched. A communist and a Nazi appointed village head snitched to the SS that the forester was harboring a Jewish girl. The SS came, burnt everybody alive, including the 3-year-old girl. Everybody. Do you think it didn't have an impact on hiding or helping? Who here, with clear conscience, would risk the lives of his families to help a stranger? Well, there were people who did. Well, there were saints. But mostly, I've noticed that there was a chain of people of goodwill. One fugitive probably must have gone through at least 30 hands, 30 pairs of hands. 30 people helped. One person gave him a ride, another let him sleep, yet another fed him and told him to get lost because he was scared. And that is the reality of Poland's countryside. The Poles did not operate the camps. In March 1940, when the Germans organized a pogrom and used Polish hoodlums in Warsaw to launch it, the National Radical Camp's Rampart underground newspaper said, death penalty for anybody who collaborates with the Germans. That includes anybody who volunteers to serve as a guard in German camps. That's before the Holocaust. That's only when mostly Polish intelligentsia was mass murdered and Jews were represented proportionally among the victims of mass shootings. They were not, at that point in 1940, overrepresented. And that is the National Radical Camp, the most anti-Jewish organization in the underground in Poland. Professor Raoul Hilberg one time said, and this is a quote from memory, I'm sorry he has passed away, because he was a voice of reason from the very beginning, even though he did not specialize in Polish-Jewish relations. He said, I've read millions of pages of German reports. Yes, German reports, not Nazi reports. And I read about people who participated and helped in the Holocaust. He said French, Norwegians, Danes, Dutch, Belgians, Hungarians, Croats, Romanians, Latvians, Lithuanians, Estonians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Russians, and the Germans, of course. He said nothing about the Poles. This is the dean of Holocaust studies. Let me tell you a little bit more about him. Professor Hilberg was in the army during World War II. He stayed in Europe and he was put in charge of German documents, Nazi captured war booty. He started reading it. Then he returned and went to school, to my alma mater, Columbia University, on GI Bill. He decided to write the first ever monograph about the extermination of the European Jewry. He told his dissertation advisor in 52 or 53 that this was going to be his topic, and his dissertation advisor is, what are you, stupid? You're going to write about some Jews? That's a kiss of death for your career. Raoul, reconsider. And Professor Hilberg, then a graduate student, was a hard-nosed and said no. And he wrote the founding monograph on the extermination of the European Jews. It took him almost 10 years to be published because every publisher said it was some stupid book about Jews. Who the heck is going to buy it? Finally, I think in 1961, a Jewish philanthropist approached Ivan Ardo, a non-entity publishing house in Chicago, and told them he would pay them to publish and he would buy the books. I think 2,000 copies. Yes. That's when the Holocaust was not sexy for one's career. That's when it really mattered. And Professor Hilberg never broke down. He did it. And this was the beginning. I hope the British Poles here, and the Poles in general, and anybody who's interested in history, will start doing it as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor. We have, this is quite late now, we have time for a couple of questions. So if anybody like have a question related to the lecture, please keep it brief. And do you have any questions? I think everybody's speechless now after such a lot of information. And if there are no more questions, there'll be a few moments to speak to Professor now. I'd like to add that if you'd like to keep informed about... oh, sorry, there's one question there.
I studied politics and I know history a little bit, and I know most of the things that you have mentioned. But the one thing I cannot understand, maybe you'll be able to explain it. It looked not so bad really between 1939 and 1945, but shortly after 1945, people like Helena Wolinska, Józef Światło, and others, they had something that what I call hatred towards Poland, Poles. Where did it come from? Thank you.
Okay, so you can come clear. You want to ask me about Jews and communism, please. No newspeak with me, just be straight. This is how I explain it to my students. I have a book in my office when we study Soviet history and Russia. There's a book, Kto rukowodził and who led the NKVD. And it's based upon NKVD documents. It has tables, lists, ethnicity, age, social profile, etc. And then I tell them, look, in 1935, the leadership of the NKVD was, it says here, 32% of Jewish origin, or 33, I don't remember. Wow! Do you know what I'm talking about? I'm talking about 30 psychopaths. There are a million Jews in every nationality, especially during a revolution. You have psychopaths. And the psychopaths self-selected to be in the NKVD. 32 sounds like woo, but really 30 of them. And then they were mostly shot by Stalin, who was purging the NKVD. There was a similar thing in Poland. Most of the secret police, after 1946, were ethnic Poles. I take it back. Those were ethnographic material who didn't know who they were, but the communists promised them social advancement, and they were Polish speakers, and most of them had been baptized. Plus, there was a handful of Jewish intelligentsia, including former Zionists, like Helena Wolinska, Luna Brystygierowa. Okay, you count them, you'll see they were in prominent positions in the secret police, and they were mass murderers. I remember General Fieldorf of the Home Army, daughter, whom I knew, yelling at me. Those were, the prosecutor was a Jew, the secret policemen who tortured my father were Jews, and the court was Jewish. Everybody was Jewish involved in this. I think one person was an ethnic Pole, that's true. Yes, but she mentioned 10 people, 10 psychopaths. What bothers me is that historians are either scared to discuss it, that there are psychopaths everywhere, and the revolutionaries are by definition psychopaths. Only counter-revolutionaries are not psychopaths because they want to restore tradition and continuity of civilization. And nobody likes to talk about it. If you look at Anne Applebaum's book about the post-war period, you'll see she discusses it in a gory detail as far as Hungary is concerned. Just read the chapters on Hungary. She's absolutely, unabashedly open about the background of some of those people. And it's something that needs to be spoken about openly. Once again, I have that book, and it says 32%. And that means a handful of psychopaths, really. Were they in charge of the terror apparatus of the Soviet Union? Yeah. Are they responsible for mass murder? But for millions of people murdered. Professor Robert Conquest told me a story when I was young and beautiful. A census was taken in the Soviet Union in 1929. Soviet census. And then Stalin ordered another census in 1938. The census takers provided him with preliminary results. He had all census takers shot. Do you know why? 25 million people missing. Oh? So, do the psychopaths bear responsibility? Yes, all of them, including Felix Dzerzhinsky, who created the machine, who was a Polish apostate Catholic nobleman, whose family was friends of my family in Vilna, whose brother died as a soldier of the Home Army, burnt alive and shot in his manor house by the Germans. So, are we going to talk about Felix Dzerzhinsky, the psychopath supreme? Do you know what he liked, aside from mass murdering people? You know what he liked? He liked to watch. He had a zoo of of homeless children, and he liked to encourage them to orgy, and he sat there and watched about 1,000 kids. He was a psycho. Most revolutionaries have problems with themselves. I don't like Freud, but perhaps they should go visit Freud before visiting the revolutions upon us. I hope that helps.
Yeah, thank you for your lecture. It was very interesting. You said about
You're very welcome.
anti-Semitism in the Western world before the war.
Uh-huh.
Could you say a little bit more about it and the foundations of this movement? Because, as you said, this is a sexy topic right now, and apparently we Polish people have a stigma of being anti-Semitic. But according to you, it was like a broader movement that captured...
No, it was broader culture. It was acceptable. It was absolutely acceptable. I can tell you one example. I forgot the ambassador's name, but I think he was the penultimate ambassador to the Sublime Porte. And in his reports, he believed that the Young Turks who took over the Sultan's government were a Jewish conspiracy. If you think I'm kidding, go to Kew National Archives and read the reports from Constantinople, from Istanbul. That's what he thought. He thought this was a Jewish conspiracy. Disraeli wrote a letter one time, I don't think it was tongue-in-cheek, to a Rothschild, and said that he would like in as a part of the Jewish conspiracy, because he heard there was a conspiracy and he would like to be a part of it. Hannah Arendt mentions it in The Origins of Totalitarianism. So there was a widespread conviction. Most of it had to do with coming to grips with modernity. Jews who are not part of the Christian world suddenly became visible, and most people were really shocked. So how do you account for this? And one of the most popular venues to account was a conspiracy. And then in Canada, my university didn't break the Jewish quota, numerus clausus, Columbia, until the 1960s. Most of it was grounded in anti-Jewish animus, but also very, very cold calculations that why admit poor people like Jews, or Catholics for that matter, they can't donate after they graduate, because they're poor. So to hell with them. Do you understand? And again, I'm not a specialist on British history. I have no idea how this worked here and how this whole thing worked itself out. But things that, from a historical point of view, were widespread somehow are forgotten. Did you know that Norway's democratic constitution included a clause that no Jews needed apply? They couldn't come to Norway. I think it was changed sometimes in the 1860s, don't quote me, 1850s, 1870s. And the Norwegians had a handful of Jews whom they delivered to the Nazis. The Norwegian police, unlike the Danish police, walked up the mountain to find 2 people who were on the list to be gassed. Oh, what am I talking about? Remember Guernsey, the only British territory under, or English territory under the Channel and an island under the German occupation? The city council willingly gave 2 or 3 Jewish refugees to the Germans. The only person who objected in one place was a crusty old aristocrat. Why? He was a Christian. But in another place, this was just natural. They don't belong. To hell with them. The welfare of the majority applies. I'm very sorry, that's how it was. Nobody likes to remember. And it took a very long time to do a study. Everybody remembers legends. If you would like to read a little bit about it, I recommend Hannah Arendt's, for instance, Hannah Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem, but you can also get specialized, which is punditry. She was very good. There are also specialized monographs. Here is a story of Danish Jews. Everybody talks about Danish rescue. For instance, the king was supposed to have worn a kippah, a yarmulke. This is nonsense. He never did anything like this. The only thing I can say positive about the king was that his guards were the only troops, you know, the bearskin guys, bearskin hat guys, were the only troops in Denmark who opposed the Nazis, the German army, as it rolled into Denmark. You know why it took the Germans to reach Copenhagen 8 hours? Well, that's how long it takes to drive from the border to Copenhagen. And the only people who shot at them were the bearskin guys, and the king told them to stop. That was the only resistance. 8 hours. And then what happened? It was a very weird situation in Denmark. The SS general responsible for the deportation of the French Jews was shifted to Denmark and told to deport Danish Jews. He shared it with a Nazi friend. He was reluctant to commence the operation immediately, so a friend informed a politician. Denmark was the only Nazi-occupied country to hold democratic elections and have a government. I'm serious, a democratic government. So he told a politician who informed a social democrat who had links to the underground. And the underground warned the Jewish community and suggested that the Jewish community should work out a deal with fishermen to ferry them to Sweden. So the Jewish community leaders went to a handful of Jews of Denmark, you know, a few thousand, went to fishermen and said, well, can you take us to Sweden? And the fisherman said, sure, pay up. And they gave him such a price that nobody could afford it. So the Jewish community leaders went back to the Danish underground, which mostly consisted of Polish intelligence, of course, but nobody wants to remember about that. I'm not kidding. Read British documents. It's all there. And the Danish underground blackmailed the fishermen who agreed to take half of what they had originally asked, and then they agreed to take half and the rest after the war. Then the head of the Kriegsmarine, German Navy, told his ships to stay away. That's not the end. The SS told the Danish police to go and arrest Jews. So you would have to be really an elderly person not to understand at that time what was going on. So they had orders, if nobody opened the door, upon knocking, they had orders to go away. So most Danish policemen said they wouldn't go at all, and the Germans deported some of them to the camps. The rest of the police went, knocked on the door, and really, I think a couple of people opened up the door and were deported from Denmark to Theresienstadt. Imagine in the Warsaw Ghetto an order where a policeman was supposed to knock and walk away. That's apples and oranges. Yes. It's very easy to kick those who had been down for 50 years as slaves of the Soviets and gloat about one's own achievements. Some of the achievements, naturally, are well, covered in silence. For instance, you know the IKEA guy? You know what party he belonged to? The Nazi party. Oh yeah. Do we boycott IKEA as Polish anti-Semites? Oh no, it's a Swedish firm, so no, we won't boycott it. Swedes have money and prestige. They're sophisticated because they were not in the communist cage. So they know how to get organized. They are not as retrograde as those Poles. Okay, so more or less. I can go to Iceland, where they had shirt movement and they had more Nazis than you can possibly imagine. Have you ever heard the Icelanders apologizing for anything? Of course, of course. Yes, and most of those movements were not National Christian. National Christians were the Carlists in Spain, Action Française to an extent in France, and the Index in Poland. To a degree, the religion of the Archangel Michael in the Iron Guard in Romania, but they were seized by, eventually they succumbed to racism and admiration of the Nazis. Same the Croatian Ustaše. So you have to discriminate between various strains of nationalism, which is not sexy. In academia, usually everybody can tell you the difference between Kim Il-sung, Rosa Luxemburg, and Gramsci, but they can't tell the difference between Roman Dmowski and Adolf Hitler, because they don't read. That's why. They don't read. Reading is tedious. Repeating slogans is very easy. And intellectuals like to sip their cafe and have theories. Doing field work is difficult. I copied 200 pounds of documents in county archives. You know what that meant? I had to buy a copier, park myself in an abandoned hostel, workers' hostel, buy a loaf of bread, and rely on good people to deliver a van load of documents and then spend a week there. Would you like to do that? Just copy. It took me 2.5 years just to research for the dissertation. 2.5 years in the field. Have you bought my book? Which one? Between Nazis and Soviets? It's very tedious. It's a break. How about negative advertisement? Well, it's wonderful. I mean, I really got excited finding out all those things, but other people are not as excited about it, especially in my field. Yes, sir.
Hello, thanks for your lecture. How could you relate to 65 billion compensation claims to the Polish government from Israeli in the light of normalization of Polish-Jewish relations?
Oh, I'd like some of that money, thank you. For scholarships, I'd give it to my kids, scholarships. Yeah?
So right now there is this very dark joke. What's the difference between Warsaw Ghetto and Palestine? The answer is 71 years.
I get very, very upset when someone compares Israelis to Nazis, to Germans. That's completely unwarranted. The Jews in the ghetto were to be exterminated. The Palestinians are to be brutalized. It's not the same story. It looks horrible on TV, and Palestinians do die, and they have horrific, they endure horrific conditions. It's nothing like the ghetto. Absolutely nothing. Only someone insane would compare it. I know it's very popular to do so. There is a huge wave of anti-Semitism that's coming from the left. Why? Because Israel is the last nation state that acts like so. So the left, in Great Britain, I think led by The Guardian, loves to kick Israel. It also has to do with hatred of America. Since the Israelis always rely on the United States for assistance, let's kick Israel if I can't kick America, because America's too powerful. So don't let yourself be manipulated. There's no absolutely no grounds to regard the Israelis as Nazis.
No, but I just wanted to start a topic. Like, what do you think about the movement that the Israelis are doing against the Palestinians in Gaza?
You mean the Israeli government?
Yeah.
The current Netanyahu government?
Yeah.
It's awful, but I'm not an Israeli. Remember, Palestinians can fall on their face 5,000 times, and they'll get up. If the Israelis fall on their face, they're dead. Once. They stumble once, and they're dead. That's it. So they're a little bit unrelaxed, I admit. And unfortunately, that's how it is. I won't solve I think the Israeli-Arab conflict is intractable in the current shape. I have no idea how to. That's well beyond my pay grade.
Okay, we have time for just one very last. There's a gentleman behind.
By the way,
sorry.
the people who rule Israel right now, the Likud party, do you know who they are? They're the Beitarim. They're Zionist revisionists. They are what they call themselves. Even some of them say to my face, "We're Jewish index." So what do you expect?
Thank you very much, Professor, for your lecture. Just a quick question. You mentioned the imbalance in academic literature.
Yes.
Do you see this being, you're contributing obviously to offsetting this and getting the real facts out. What are the centers, where is this in the academic world? Where do you see these centers of interest to offset this? Where is this research being carried out? Are there certain institutions, certain foundations, certain universities?
Well, certainly the Kościuszko Chair in Polish Studies does a little bit of work. Usually, much work is done at the Institute of National Remembrance in Poland, but it's in Polish, so nobody knows about it, and it just lingers on the shelves. Generally, people avoid it because they're scared, because this is it's a career breaker. See, I don't care. I was born under totalitarianism. What am I supposed to be afraid of? I only have one life. There are works coming out continuously. For instance, I think the director of the Holocaust Center here wrote a book which is mostly about the extermination of the Jewish population in the Generalgouvernement, but he also includes the Christian experience, which was horrific. And then he buries in the footnotes, we don't know how many Christians died, maybe 300,000. That's gross revisionism. The whole book is pretty good. By what I'm used to, and what I'm used to is horrible. It's just not scholarship. But this is, I don't know, there must be some kind of a way, first to research in Poland, and then to get Polish scholars to be known in the West. Except the ones who want to be known are usually sexy. So they become the amen corner of whatever mainstream academia produces. Perhaps the best example of it, of brainlessness, was the case of Jedwabne. Everybody just sang hosannas, hallelujahs. And I asked, has anybody hit the archives? No. What part?
Just one last question.
Okay.
Welcome everybody. My name is Karol Kwiatkowski. Professor, thank you very much for your very interesting speech about the very different part of history between Polish and Jewish. The question is, I won't use the S word, but the question is, what do you think? What is your theory about why British and Americans did nothing about that all horrible thing what happened during the Second World War in the all camps? And like you said,
I explained, they had their priorities and they didn't care enough.
What the priorities? Something else. It's more
to win the war. To win the war. That was the priority.
Oh, okay, but like IG Farben was placed.
Oh, you're talking about the involvement of Western, like IBM, etc., Western businesses. Of course, capitalists always want to make money. So why be surprised? And if it's on at the cost of Jewish or whatever dead, what do they care? Profit. The profit line is what matters. I would like to, I'm glad you perked up because that made me remember. Unfortunately, we were unable to project this because I don't have the pictures digitalized, but I wanted to, at the end, leave you something to remember that's nice, not horrific. Here is a series of photographs taken by a German soldier in a little place called Jagiellonówka, which is in the Białystok region, Podlasie. Here, German soldiers arrive and burn a shtetl. The shtetl, which also had a Christian part, including a church. But they burned the whole thing, mostly the Jewish part. And this is the Wehrmacht. They have helmets, and I looked at them very closely. I think this marks them as the Wehrmacht. The people in soft hats, I think, are the SS. They're field uniforms of the SS. But I don't have a magnifying glass, and I only got it today. So forgive me if it turns out it's the military police or something like that. But it looks to me like the Einsatzgruppe. So the Germans came. There is, you see, gutters. There is no water in the gutters. It means no one was permitted to extinguish the fire. The Germans set the shtetl, the little town, ablaze, and they are moving through it with their cannon. Here's a cannon, 2, 3 motorbikes, and the rest are just marching. Then they herded the Jewish population against the church wall. And as you see from, you can't see it, but if you should come up and look at it, the Jewish here on the picture are hysterical. They're scared completely, women and children. The children and women are wailing. It's visible in the face. Here, the Germans, the soft hat guys, are herding some Jewish males. Males in semi-military, semi-civilian outfits. I don't know what that means. They were just herding them towards the rest of the population. And then a German officer showed up on the horse. A German officer showed up on the horse, and he wears a helmet, and I think he has a Wehrmacht uniform. And there's some kind of a conversation between Germans and locals, and I don't know if these people are Polish or Christians or Jews. But here is a picture of the little town burnt, and here's a picture of the Jewish population against the wall, but calm. The Germans marching through. Do you know why the Jews calmed down and the Germans stood down? The priest came out with a cross and led a procession. The priest got out, facing the SS and the Wehrmacht, took a cross up and marched between the executioners and the people herded against the wall. Now, unless you're from that little town, nobody would know. I certainly didn't know about it. Well, there you go. He knows about it, but I didn't know about it until this afternoon. I looked at it. Germans like souvenir pictures. So if you have German friends and family, like I do, ask them for their grandparents' souvenir pictures. You have no idea. They get on eBay, and people don't know what they have. Because now, Grandpa's dead. Whoops, the SS uniform falls out of the closet next to the BMW. And the pictures. He was a Polish Nazi, thank you very much. Let's go home.
Once again, thank you very much, Professor, for a very interesting lecture. The recording of the lecture will be available on our website, Jagiellonianclub.org. So please share this recording with any of your friends that might be interested in the topic or may have maybe misinformed. If you'd like to get further information about the events organized by the Jagiellonian Club, please search it in Google, Jagiellonianclub.org. It's on the website. I'd like to encourage you to go to Amazon.com and Amazon.co.uk and search for Professor books. They are very interesting, really eye-opening. They publish in both Polish and English. And once again, thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much, Professor.
Last time I checked on American Amazon, one of my books after the Holocaust was $400. So I PDF'd it and put it on our school's profile. You can download it for free.